Rabosai, we're here on Daf Ayin Dalid, and we're taking a look now at Tana Rabbanan. Ayin Dalid Omid Beis, and we're going to count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top. So yesterday we had a long discussion about Koi, and we categorized Koi under 3 different possible categories, Ayin Sham. Now at this point, we're actually going back to the Mishnah at the beginning of this parak on Ayin Gimel, and the Mishnah says that Yom Kippur Maser B'Achilu Shesiyah. And first, we want to derive the Isur Achila Shesiyah on Yom Kippur. Tana Rabbanan. So I'm going to read the whole pasuk to you. It says, "B'chodesh Hashvi'i B'asar LaChodesh Ta'anu Es Nafsho Seich." Okay, that's the pasuk of Inui. And somehow from this pasuk, we're going to have to derive that you're not allowed to eat or drink anything on Yom Kippur. But exactly how we derive that is very complicated. Okay. Now, the first question that we want to address here in the context of this brisa and interpreting Ta'anuas Nafshel Seichem, which I guess in English you could maybe translate as afflict your souls. What does that require? Does that require an active affliction? Ta'anu? Yochel, I might think, Sheyeshe B'chama, he's sitting in the shade. It's a very hot Yom Kippur. And he has to get up from his place in the shade, and he's got to sit himself down in the boiling sun. Or Batsina. Or let's say it's a cold day, and he's indoors. He's got, heat, central heating. He's got to get up and go outside and freeze to afflict himself. Because the pasuk says, "Ta'anu es nafsho." Deshi, it's time. And this brisa has what I find a very, very strange kind of drasha, a derivation that you don't have to actively put yourself through an affliction. Go sit on pins on Yom Kippur. Why? Because in that very same pasuk where it says Ta'anu es nafsho seichem, it says v'chol malacha lo sas. So we have in one pasuk a double or a two-sided sword. There's the Isur of Inui and the Isur of Malachim, engaging in labor. Now, is there any way of actively guaranteeing kol malacha lo sasu? The answer is no. By definition, kol malacha lo sasu is passive. Do not engage in labor. And therefore, by virtue of the analogy to the beginning of that pasuk of lo sa'anu, we're going to assume that in order to avoid violating the inui, like malacha, just be passive. Do you hear the analogy of the Gemara? Just like in malacha, the Torah is saying you don't do malacha. Here too in the Nisa, the Torah is saying don't do something. Don't actively violate inui. Don't actively violate Isur malacha. And therefore, the Torah is telling you don't do malacha, meaning be in a state of passivity. So to inui, by virtue of this analogy, requires that you be passive, not to actively subject yourself to suffering, but be passive. The Ema, the Gemara says, Hecha de Yosef b'shimsha v'chayim le. Let's say he's already sitting outdoors. So he got there at 8 in the morning, for Birkas HaShachar at the beginning of davening, and now it's midday, and the sun is at its zenith, and he's boiling hot. Lo nemale kum tuv betula. We're not going to allow him to get up and go into the shade. There's a shady tree over there, shady spot, because he's required to be passive. And if we'd stand up and go into the shade, he would be actively violating Inui by relieving his suffering of boiling under the sun. Or here's a flip case. Yasib Betula, the Karle, he's freezing cold because he's under the shade. Lo Nemalei Kum Tuv B'Shimshu. We're not going to allow him to get up, go out into the sun, and warm up in the sun. This reminds me of like swimming pools. You get out of a swimming pool, and the first thing you want to do is lay down in the sun because you're cold from the pool, and the cold air is, if you don't dry yourself immediately, so you want to sit in the sun. No. We're not going to allow you to warm yourself up in the sun. We want you to remain passively in a state of Inui. So if Inui requires a passive state, so it means that if I happen to be lucky and I'm sitting in the shade, I don't have to get up and boil myself in the sun. But what if I'm sitting in the sun and I'm boiling myself? I'm not going to allow you to undermine, to vitiate the state of Inui as you're boiling the sun and go into the shade. So Gemara says, Dunya de Malach. Again, we're going to go back to that axis, that analogy between the Isur Malach and the Isur Inui. Ma Malach lo chalakta ba. You made no distinction. Whatever's a malacha is a malacha, and it's asur. Whatever's not a malacha is not a malacha, and it's mutter. So that's called lo chilakta ba. Af inui shelo techalek bo. We don't make any distinctions. And if we're telling you that if you're sitting in enjoying the sun, you don't have to get up and freeze, or if you're enjoying a cool air, you don't have to get up and boil yourself by putting yourself in the sun, then we're going to say in the reverse too, that if you're boiling yourself in the sun, we're not going to say, well, don't enjoy the benefit of relocating yourself into the shade. That Issa doesn't exist. We're going to have to be absolutely consistent. And just like we are in Malacha, either it is a Malacha and it's Asur, it's not a Malacha, it's Mutter, we're not going to make distinctions. So too, either this action, let's call it Achila or Shasiya, is Asur B'Toras violating Bittul Inui, or it's not. And if it's not a violation of Inui, then in all cases it's Mutter. Okay. Tanya Idoch. Now we have another brisa. It says, should we obligate him to make sure he's sitting out in the boiling hot sun or in the freezing cold? Shechayoven olev kares b'mokom acher, af inui nefesh shechayoven olev kares b'mokom acher. Now, this second brisa addresses the exact identical question of the first brisa, and again, like the first brisa, bases its conclusion and its proof on an analogy to the Isur Malacha, but for a totally, totally different reason. And that is that we need something outside of the context of Yom Kippur, which would which would constitute, which would comprise an Iser Kares. So in the case of Yom Kippur, we're just going to simply compare it to Shabbos. That just like in Shabbos, there's a malacha, 39 malachas that generate a Chiv Kares, a Chiv Misa, so too in Yom Kippur. That's as far as malach on Yom Kippur. Now let's talk about Inu. Where else in the Torah does the Torah tell me don't eat? We're going to have to find, in the context of this parallel and this analogy to malacha, we're going to have to find a davar shechayav oleh kares b'makom acher. In malacha, we have no problem. B'makom acher means on Shabbos. But what's b'makom acher in the case of an Isur Achila? I mean, I know that on Yom Kippur, if you eat, you get kares. But what other achila could there be that would generate an Isur kares? And the answer is Af inu nefesh chayav olav b'makom acher ezuv zeh zeu pigul v'nosar. You know what you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur? Pigul or nosar. Why? Because pigul and nosar are chiv kares. If you eat pigul, or if you eat nosar, like pigul was that case that we discussed in the earliest year about a Kohen who during his avodas his machshava of chutzes mano, and the basar of the korban now becomes also the Isur Kares under the law of pigul. Or if we have basar kodshim that passes a lot of time, that becomes nosar. And the Torah says if you eat nosar, you chayav kares. These are the only two isurim that apply to Yom Kippur, because these are the only two isurim that are parallel to malacha. Just like in malacha we find chiyuv kares b'makom acher, so too in the Isur Inu we have to find the chiyuv kares b'makom acher, and all we can come up with is pigul and nosar. Rabbi say, do you imagine, as we say in Yiddish, far, what is going on here? And if I were to stop, press the stop button at this point in the brisa, the only thing that you're enjoying from eating on Yom Kippur is pigul and nosar. And again, you might ask me, pigul and nosar is also the whole year round. So what did you add by adding Yom Kippur to it? But somehow, magically, on Yom Kippur, if you eat pigul and nosar, you're going to violate a double chiyuv kares. We're going to be kares you twice. I don't know what that means. And we're going to be kares you because of pigul and nosar and because of Yom Kippur. The entire Isur Achila of Inui on Yom Kippur can be reduced to pigul and nosar. I'm not exactly sure why the Gemara mentions pigul and nosar, because if you eat chametz on Pesach, because Pesach can never coincide with Chelev. Chelev is an Isur Kares. Why did the Gemara mention Chelev? I don't know. Also, where did Shtia fit in? It's not my kasha about Chelev, but me'achru b'achilas pigul v'nosar yesh chiyuv kares b'tnei atzman the whole year round yechayiv kares. In kain li'eza inyan savra braysa ka'esh sheyeh chayav on Yom Kippur mitshum chovas inu b'yom ha'kippurim. Hello, yef shalachayvo li'adam shtei krisus. Kares means you'll die by a certain age, whatever that age is. So what you're going to pile up another kares on top of one kares? You're going to kill him twice. I mean, you can't kill a person twice. All right, we'll come back to this question in a minute. Does anybody ask my question about Chelev? Anyway, now, Avi pigul v'nosar she'en b'kares v'lo avi asatevel she'eno b'kares. Right, if a person eats tevel, that means he's got one of the 5 species of grains, and they were not mafresh trumas of meisers. That's called tevel. He's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. Anybody who eats tevel is chayav misa b'dei shamayim, which is one notch lower than kares. You have to see why and how that works out. So now, if a person were to eat tevel on Yom Kippur, he doesn't violate the Isur Inu. Of course, he's chayav misa b'dei shemayim, but he's not chayav kares for violating inui on Yom Kippur. So from the perspective of inui on Yom Kippur, if I'm very hungry on Yom Kippur, bring me a lot of tevel to eat. Talmud lomar ta'anu v'inisa mesnafshel sefer riba. We have a halach, we have a principle in interpreting the Torah that if the Torah adds and repeats itself, then we have to be marbe. It must be expanding the scope. So to expand the scope of the Isra Achiyah to include something that doesn't generate kares, but only misa v'dei shamayim, that's tevel, we're going to see that there's a repetition in the Torah, and the Torah says ta'anu es nafshel secher, and then it says v'nisem es nafshel secher. So there's a redundancy, a repetition in the Torah, and that's a ribu. So the ribu expands my circle to include an Isra of Achilas Tevel, which is only Misa B'dei Shamayim. Aviyat Tevel should be Misa V'lo Aviyas in the Vela. You're going to tell me that if an animal drops dead without Shechita, then as far as Yom Kippur is concerned, there's no Isra Inui in eating the flesh, the carcass of an Avela, because an Avela is only a Chiv Malchus. It doesn't measure up to a Chiv Kares or a Chiv Misa. She'ena b'Misa. Talmud Lomar, Ta'anu v'Nisa Mesnafshel Seichem. Riva. We have another extra pasuk. And it says, Ta'anu v'Nisa. Do you want to do me a favor, Stephen? Open up, if you can, to the parsha in Emor Vayikra. No, this is way before him. Vayikra Tes Zayin, Pasuk Chav Tes. Maybe you could read it out loud for me. Oh, so that's number one. So that's Pasuk Chav Tes, correct? And that's the first time it says Tanu es nafshel seich. Now, fast forward to Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Does it say that V'nisem es nafshel seichem? Okay. So we have number one, Ta'anu es nafshel seichem. And number two, we have the Nisem es nafshel seichem. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Is there a third time that it says Ta'anu es nafshel seichem there? Or V'nisem? Let me just get. Don, you have an English translation, right? Let's just see. I also have an English translation. My stash away here. Masifta is not doing it for me, so let me see if the English. The third time it says V'nisem es nafshel seichem, that would be helpful. Ayin Daled Amin Beis. See. No, there's nothing here in the English either. I guess we have to rely on ourselves over here. Notes. Oh, good. Came through in the clutch. Want to listen? The commandment to afflict oneself on Yom Kippur is stated 5 times. Okay, so first it was 29, right? That was the first pasuk we read. Then we fast forwarded to 31. Okay, now what you have to do is you've got to fast forward to this 23rd chapter. Now we're in Emor. So in chapter 16, we only have it twice. But now we look in Emor, and we're looking in chapter Chaf Gimel, pasuk Chaf Zayin. Can you get that out?
Yeah.
What does it say there?
Right.
Now fast forward in the same chapter to pasuk 32, 5 psukim later. What does it say there? And finally, if you open up to Sefer Bamidbar, at the end of Bamidbar, in Perek Chavtes, pasuk Zayin. What does it say there? I like the big blue chumash. You have to turn so many pages. So 5 times. Okay, so now we're up to number 3, right? The first time we only limited to Chayiv Karis, and that's Pigul Benosa. The second time, the repetition teaches me even a Chayiv Misa in the case of Tevel. The third time is going to teach me Nevela, where there's an Isur Malchus without an Chayiv Misa. Now we get over obvious and Nevela, Shubalav, below obvious Hachulin. Shainabalav. What about any piece of whatever that I'm allowed to eat the whole year round? That's number 4, Riba. Avi, Chulin, She'ena Bekum Echol, Chulin, which either you eat or you don't eat, you're not obligated to eat. But below obvious that Truma She'i Bekum Echol, but there's a mitzvah for the Kohanim to eat Truma. And maybe in the light of that mitzvah, it's not considered prohibited on Yom Kippur. Talmud Lomar Ta'anu V'Nisam Esnafshel Sechem Riba, the 5th time that it says Ta'anu, a 5th Inu that expands the scope of the Isur to include even Achilas Truma, which is Bekum Echol. Now let's go back for a moment to the question that we raised before, and that is Pigul V'Nosar are B'Karetz the whole year round. So what did you gain by adding Lo Sa'anu Es Nafshel Sechem if the Torah is just simply telling you that you're not allowed to eat Pigul and Nosar? You can't be Chayiv Karis twice. I want to give you 5 answers to this question that are summarized here in the Yalkut HaBiyun. Number 1, the Mesaras Hashas answers that if he will violate the Isur twice, he'll be chayiv 2 sets of malchus. So it's like a case where he ate dam and then he ate dam again. He'll get 1 set of malchus for the first kizayis dam and another for the second. Here also, he's going to get 2 sets of malchus, 1 for pigul and 1 for b'nitzah v'snafshel sechem violating Yom Kippur. Second answer is the Rashbi Shantz. He wants to know in the case of shogeg, so he forgot it was Yom Kippur, he ate pigul, he forgot it was pigul. And the chiddush is that he has to bring 2 chatos, 1 chatos for the shogeg vis-a-vis pigul, and the other for the shogeg vis-a-vis Yom Kippur. The Rashash says that let's say he was a shogeg regarding pigul, but mazid regarding Yom Kippur. Notice he knew very well he's not allowed to eat it because it's Yom Kippur. He didn't know he was eating pigul. So in such a case, he'll be chayiv kares for the mazid of Yom Kippurim, and he'll be chayiv a korban chatos for the shogeg of pigul. Number 4, the Maratz Chaya says, and what happens according to the sheet of Rebbe that Yom Kippur is mechaper afilu below tshuva. So then when he eats pigel on Yom Kippur, so again, according to the Maratz Chayes, in Rebbe's frame of reference, Yom Kippur is mechaper for the Isser of Pigel, but it can't be mechaper for the Inui. Because if he rejects Inui, then as far as the Kapar power of Yom Kippur vis-a-vis Inui, he's going to be Chayiv Karetz. There's no Yom Kippur to be mechaper for Inui. And the Marshal answers based on a smag that let's say it's half a shear of Pigel and half a shear of Nosar. We have a halacha that you're not necessarily two different isurim to generate a chiv karetz. But as far as Inui is concerned, we can integrate both the chatzi zayis of Nosar with the chatzi zayis of Pigel to create one violation, one integrated violation of the Isser Inui, and it'd be Chayiv Karetz for Yom Kippur, even though we wouldn't be Chayiv neither for Pigel nor for Nos. That's my favorite answer, the Marshal, even though it's not very practical, but in Lumbus, it's a beautiful, beautiful answer. Now, here we have another question that the Achronim raise. How could Yom Kippur add an Isser Inui to Pigel the Notzar? We have a principle called Ein Isser Chal al Isser. So if you have an Isser Chal A at time T1, you cannot superimpose a second Isser at time T2 onto the first Isser. So how could there be a Chalotz Yom Kippur on Pigel? It's already Asur Midin Pigel, and they're both equal. They're both a Chiv Karetz. Now you could have answered that maybe we have what's called an Isser Mosif, because Yom Kippur is adding and expanding the scope of the Isser, because now you can't eat anything on Yom Kippur, not just Pigel and Nosa. But that's not true, because right now the Gemara has only one limud of Inisem the first time around that teaches me Pigel and Nosa. So there's no Isser Mosif. So he quotes an answer, the name of the Siach Yitzchak. Very often we quote the Siach Yitzchak. He says that since with regard to Pigel and Nosar, he's chayiv with an achil of kizayis, but on Yom Kippur, be chayiv even on less than a kizayis. All he needs is kikakoseves. I'm sorry. What did I just say? Did I say that koseves was more or less than a kizayis? I don't remember what I said. What? Koseves is less. So I think that's wrong. I think that a koseves is more than a kizayis. We mentioned this. We said that back in the Mishnah. Let me just double check, and then I'll let you go for the day, for the next 3 weeks. Let's see. Oh, back in the Mishnah. Ha'ochel ki koseves hagaso chayev. Koseves hagaso is longer than a kizayis, is it not? Let me just see if he has it here. Yeah, I'm 99% sure that koseves hagaso is larger than a kizayis. And that's, in order to get Yitzuvei Daite, which is the nature of the Yitzer Inu on Yom Kippur, you have to eat more than a kazayis. Kazayis is not enough to, so to speak, settle him down. So what the Siach Yitzchak is saying is that if I had pigul and nosar, I'd be chayev for a kazayis. But in the case of Yom Kippurim, he's got to go beyond the kazayis and eat kikos seves. Therefore, the Isa Yom Kippur cannot be chal on an Isur that he's already chayav on bishum pigul unosar. How does this solve the problem of an Isur chal Isur? I guess he's saying it's just two different Isurim for the fact that it's two different Shiurim. So again, when he eats a kazayas, he's not chayav for Yom Kippur because he didn't eat a shir of koseves. Oh, I got it. This is what the Siach Yitzchak is saying. If he eats a kazayas of pigul and nosar, he's only going to be chayav kares for pigul and nosar. Now Yom Kippur is going to say that if he eats another small amount equal to the increment between a kazayas and a koseves agasa, he's going to be chayav kares for Yom Kippur. And therefore, Yom Kippur is adding another element, another Isur into the equation. Does that make sense? On. He writes Kishem Mashlim Koseves, which literally translates means he makes up the difference between a kazayis and a koseves by adding achila of more pigul, of more nosar. So he goes beyond the zayis and he eats a full koseves hagas. Again, he's not chayav for the first kazayis except for pigul. He gets kares for pigul, but now, but there's no violation of Yom Kippur because he didn't eat a koseves hagas. But now that he makes up the difference, he's going to be chayav kares for Yom Kippur. I just don't understand one thing. What do you mean he makes up the difference? I mean, the first Isaiah's word that he ate there was no Isaac Yom Kippur because he ate Isaac Chal Isaac. The words kishem mashlimo l'koseves bother me. As if to say he just has to add a little bit of an increment in order to bridge the gap between Kizayas and Koseves Hagas. That's not really true. Because as far as the Kizayas is concerned, that's not also. Okay, then. So this is where we're going to stop. And wish a bon voyage to Steve or Mrs. Steve. And thank you for joining us today, everyone. Have a great day.